The first time I saw Earl Kesterson smile was the day I pulled up to my uncle's cabin with a truck full of tools and enough ambition to think I could fix 30 years of neglect in a single summer. He was standing at the edge of his property, maybe 200 yards down the gravel road, one hand raised in a wave that looked more like a warning than a greeting. I waved back. He turned and walked into his house, and I didn't see him again for a week. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for friends. My name is Hadrian Ironhold, and in the spring of 2019, I was a man trying to outrun the wreckage of his own life. 34 years old, recently divorced, and burning through the last of my savings on a property I'd inherited from an uncle I barely knew. The cabin sat on 80 acres of mixed forest near Rhinelander, Wisconsin. White pine and red oak, some old-growth hemlock in the ravines, and enough whitetail sign to make my heart ache with professional envy. I'd been running hunting guides out of Wausau for 8 years by then. Started as an assistant to a guy named Mick Terrence, learned the trade, eventually bought him out when his knees gave up. Built a decent reputation guiding deer and turkey hunts for city clients who wanted to feel like pioneers for a long weekend. The money was good. The marriage wasn't. Sarah left in February right after Valentine's Day, which she later admitted was intentional. Said she wanted me to remember the date. I told her that was cruel, and she said, "So was watching you choose those woods over me for 8 years." She wasn't wrong. I just couldn't admit it then. So when the letter came from a lawyer in Rhinelander telling me my Uncle Vernon had died and left me everything, I took it as a sign. A fresh start. A place where I could be alone with the trees and the silence and not have to explain myself to anyone. The cabin was a disaster, but it was my disaster. 2 stories of hand-hewn logs, a fieldstone chimney that had seen better decades, and a roof that leaked in 3 places I'd already found, and probably more I hadn't. The first weekend, I replaced the porch steps and discovered the support beams underneath had rotted through. The second weekend, I patched the roof and cleaned out a nest of raccoons from the attic. By the third weekend, I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in months: hope. My weekday routine stayed the same. Monday through Thursday, I ran the guide business from my apartment in Wausau, handling bookings and equipment maintenance, leading the occasional overnight for clients who couldn't wait for the weekend. Friday afternoon, I'd load up the truck and make the hour-and-a-half drive north. I'd work until dark, sleep in the one room I'd made habitable, and drive back a Sunday evening. The forest around the cabin was everything I'd spent my career teaching city people to appreciate. Trails cut through stands of birch so white they glowed in the evening light. Deer trails crossed the property like highways, worn down to bare earth by generations of does and bucks making their way to the beaver pond on the eastern edge. I set up trail cameras the first weekend, a dozen of them scattered across the property, and checked them obsessively. The photos were gorgeous. Whitetails by the dozen, a black bear and her cubs passing through at dawn, coyotes, foxes, a family of wild turkeys so fat they looked ready for Thanksgiving. I'd sit on the new porch steps with a beer and scroll through the images on my laptop, planning the hunts I'd lead here someday. That was the dream anyway. Turn the cabin into a base of operations, sell the Wausau business, and go all in on this new chapter. Build something that was mine alone, untouched by Sarah's memory or the failure it represented. Earl Kesterson was the only complication. His property bordered mine to the north, another 100-plus acres of forest he'd inherited from his own family decades before. I'd wave when I saw him. He'd wave back. Neither of us made any effort to close the distance. I learned what little I knew about him from the woman who ran the hardware store in town. Marge Kowalski, 60-something, with a cigarette voice and opinions about everyone. Earl had worked at the paper mill in Rhinelander for 30 years, she told me. Retired in the early 90s, lost his wife to cancer not long after, and hadn't left that property for more than groceries since. He had dogs, 3 of them, big mutts that barked at everything, and he kept to himself in a way that made the locals call him Hermit behind his back. Good neighbor, though, Marge said, ringing up my order of wood screws and caulk. Mine's his own business. You could do worse. I agreed. I could do worse. The first wrongness came on my third weekend at the cabin. I noticed the silence before I noticed anything else. It was a Saturday morning, early June, and I'd woken at dawn to check the trail cameras. The air was cool and damp, the kind of morning where you can see your breath in the fours. T should be alive with sound. Birdsong, squirrels chattering, the distant hammering of woodpeckers. Instead, nothing. I stood on the porch with my coffee and listened, really listened, and felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving the trees motionless around me. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know that silence like that meant something. Predator nearby, usually. A big cat or a bear passing through, putting every small thing on alert. I grabbed my rifle, an old Remington .308 I'd been carrying since I was 17, and walked the property line. The trail cameras told a story I didn't understand. 2 weeks prior, they'd captured 78 individual deer sightings. The previous week, it's 23. This week, I pulled the cards and scrolled through them on my phone, standing there in the silent woods with my rifle across my chest. Nothing. Not a single deer on any camera. I checked the timestamps, checked the batteries, checked everything I could think of. The cameras were working fine. The deer had simply vanished. That wasn't normal. That wasn't how deer behaved unless something had driven them out, and whatever that something was, it would have to be significant. A pack of wolves, maybe, though they hadn't been confirmed in this part of Wisconsin for decades. A bear with cubs could clear an area temporarily, but not like this, not a complete evacuation. I walked the eastern border of the property, moving slow, scanning the underbrush for sign. That's when I found the carcass. It was a doe, or what remained of one. She'd been posed against a white pine, her body arranged in a position that shouldn't have been possible without assistance. Her legs were folded beneath her, almost peaceful, and her head was tilted up toward the canopy, like she was watching something in the branches. The arrangement was deliberate. That was the first thing I noticed, and it stopped me cold. The second thing I noticed was the surgery. I'm no stranger to predator kills. I've seen what wolves do, what bears do, what coyotes do when they bring down prey. They tear and rip and feast without ceremony. This was different. The doe's abdomen had been opened with what looked like precision cuts, clean lines that exposed the body cavity without the ragged edges of teeth or claws. Her organs were gone. All of them removed cleanly with no blood pooled beneath the body. I stood there for a long time, rifle in my hands, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Poachers, I thought finally. Some sick bastard who gets off on this kind of thing. Meth heads from one of the rural cook sites, maybe. Their minds gone wrong enough that this seemed like entertainment. It was a rational explanation. It was the only explanation that made sense. I took photos with my phone and called the DNR office on Monday morning. The wildlife officer who took my call sounded bored until I started describing the arrangement. And then he sounded skeptical, predator activity. He said finally, "You'd be surprised what a bear can do. Bears don't arrange deer to look like they're sitting. Clears throat, you sure that's what you saw?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The silence got worse over the following days. I set up more cameras, positioned them to cover the area where I'd found the doe. When I came back the next weekend, 3 of them had been knocked from their mounts. Not damaged, just removed carefully and set on the ground face down. The memory cards were gone. Earl's dogs had stopped barking. I noticed that on Saturday afternoon walking the property line near his fence. Those dogs had announced my presence every single visit, howling and snarling at any movement on my side of the boundary. Now they were quiet. I caught a glimpse of them through the trees, huddled together on Earl's porch, pressed against the front door like they were trying to get inside. I mentioned the deer to my hunting clients that week. We were doing a scouting trip for fall bow season. 3 guys from Milwaukee who worked in finance and liked to pretend they were Daniel Boone on weekends. They laughed when I described the carcass. "That's a good campfire story," one of them said. "You should charge extra for atmosphere." I stopped talking about it after that, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop walking the property with my rifle, scanning the tree line for movement, listening for sounds that never came. The silence had a weight to it now, pressing down on the forest like something physical. My instincts, honed by 2 decades of hunting, screamed at me that something was wrong, desperately wrong, and my rational mind kept insisting it was nothing. The rational mind lost that argument on a Thursday evening in late June. Clear as throat, I'd taken a half day from the business, driven up early to get a few extra hours of work in on the cabin. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange through the trees, and I was on my knees replacing a section of floorboard in the main room when I heard movement on the porch. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, the boards creaking under significant weight. I reached for the rifle propped against the wall and moved to the window, staying low. The porch was empty, but on the railing, placed precisely in the center like an offering, sat a trail camera, one of the ones that had gone missing. The memory card was still inside. I didn't watch the footage until I was inside with every door locked. Even then, my hands shook as I slid the card into my laptop. The first 100 images were normal, empty forest, time stamps from the week before. Then the motion sensor started triggering at night, capturing frame after frame of nothing but darkness between the trees. The last image stopped my breath. Eyes, two amber eyes reflecting the infrared flash. Position maybe 30 ft from the camera. They were 8 ft off the ground, far too high for any canine, and set too wide apart in whatever skull held them. The shape behind those eyes was lost in shadow, just a suggestion of mass darker than the darkness around it. I stared at that image until my laptop screen dimmed, and the silence outside pressed against the cabin walls like something waiting to be let in. I don't know how long I sat there staring at that image. Long enough for the last light to drain from the sky outside. Long enough for the cabin to grow cold because I hadn't thought to start a fire. Long enough for my coffee to go from lukewarm to ice. The eyes in that photograph weren't right. That was the thought I kept coming back to. The one I couldn't escape, no matter how many times I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. I'd spent my entire adult life in these woods. I knew every predator, every scavenger, every creature that called this part of Wisconsin home. Nothing had eyes like that. Bears were the obvious first thought. A black bear standing on its hind legs could reach 7, maybe 8 ft at full stretch. But bear eyes don't reflect amber. They reflect green or yellow depending on the light source. And they're set close together in that broad, flat face. These eyes were too far apart, positioned in a way that suggested a skull shaped nothing like a bear's. A dog then, some kind of feral dog gone wild in the woods, maybe crossed with something bigger. I'd heard stories of wolf-dog hybrids up near the Michigan border, animals that grew larger than either parent species and developed all sorts of strange behaviors. But even the biggest wolf-dog wouldn't put its eyes 8 ft off the ground. Not standing naturally, not without climbing something. Could it have been climbing? I grabbed my laptop and zoomed in on the image, studying those darkness around those eyes for any sign of a tree trunk, a rock formation, something that would explain the height. The resolution wasn't good enough. The infrared flash had illuminated just enough to capture those eyes and the suggestion of mass behind them, leaving everything else in impenetrable shadow. A person. That was my next thought, and it felt more rational than anything else I'd considered. Someone in a costume, maybe. Some sick bastard who'd been arranging deer carcasses and stealing my trail cameras, now escalating to psychological warfare. It would explain the deliberate way the camera had been returned to my porch, placed perfectly on the railing like a message. Look what I can do. Look how close I can get. I'd dealt with problem people before. Poachers who thought they owned every acre of forest in the state. Drunks who wandered onto hunting properties and caused trouble. Once, a guy who'd followed one of my clients back to camp with a rifle and some delusion that we'd shot his dog. People were unpredictable, dangerous, but they were still people. You could reason with them, threaten them, call the sheriff on them if it came to that. But the eyes in that photograph didn't look like anything a person could fake. No costume, no matter how elaborate, would produce that exact shade of amber, that wet gleam that suggested something alive and aware behind them. I closed the laptop. Friday morning, I drove into Rhinelander and stopped at the DNR office in person. The same wildlife officer I'd spoken to on the phone, a guy named Henderson with a gray mustache and the permanent expression of someone who'd heard every crazy story the Northwoods had to offer, listened to my description with the kind of patience that bordered on condescension. "You're saying someone put a camera on your porch," he said. One of my cameras, the ones that were stolen, clears throat, and the footage shows what exactly. I brought the laptop with me, already open to the image. I turned it toward him and watched his face as he studied the screen. Eyes, Henderson said flatly. You're showing me a picture of eyes, 8 ft off the ground. Look at the position relative to the camera mount. That camera was mounted at chest H. 8 on a tree, could be anything. Clear's throat, he pushed the laptop back toward me. Owl probably. Great horned owls nest up in the high branches and they've got that eye shine you're describing. An owl with eyes 3 in a cross and set 4 ft apart. Henderson's expression didn't change. Look, Mr. Ironhold, I understand you're new to the property, and I understand things can seem strange when you're not used to the sounds and sights of deep woods. But what you're describing, surgically mutilated deer, stolen cameras, mysterious eyes in the night, it sounds like you've been reading too many internet forums. I'm a professional hunting guide. I've been working these woods for, and you should know better. He stood, signaling that our conversation was over. My advice, get some better locks for your cabin, maybe invest in a security system. If someone's trespassing, file a report with the sheriff's department. But unless you've got something more concrete than a blurry photo of what's probably owl eyes, there's nothing the DNR can do for you. I left the office with my face burning, the laptop tucked under my arm, like evidence no one would examine. Henderson had dismissed me the same way my clients had, the same way I'd probably dismissed 100 people who tried to tell me about strange things they'd seen in the woods. The crazy ones, I'd always called them privately. The ones who spent too much time alone and started imagining things. Now I was one of them. I stopped at Marge Kowalski's hardware store on the way back, more for the human contact than because I needed anything. She was behind the counter as always, a cigarette smoldering in the ashtray despite the no-smoking signs she'd put up years ago and never enforced. You look like hell, she said by way of greeting. Rough week. That cabin finally beat you. Something like that. I wandered the aisles without really seeing what was on the shelves, my mind still churning through explanations and coming up empty. Finally, I circled back to the counter. Marge, you ever hear anything strange about the woods up by my uncle's place? Old stories, local legends, anything like that. She took a drag from her cigarette and studied me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Strange how? I don't know. Animals behaving weird, people seeing things they couldn't explain. This about your neighbor. Earl, the question caught me off guard. Why would you ask that? Because Earl Kesterson used to be the most social man in this town. Bold in the league, coached Little League for 6 years, organized the church fish fry every spring. Then sometime in the late 80s he just stopped. Stopped coming to town, stopped talking to people, stopped doing anything except sitting on that property of his. Some folks say he lost his mind when his wife died. But she didn't pass until 92, and he'd already been a hermit for years by then. I thought about Earl standing at the edge of his property that first day, his wave that looked more like a warning than a greeting. He ever say anything about why? About what changed? Marge shook her head. Earl doesn't say much of anything to anyone anymore. But I'll tell you this, dumb, when your Uncle Vernon was alive, those two were thick as thieves. Spent hours together on that shared property line, talking about God knows what. And Vernon, he got the same way toward the end. Stopped coming to town, stopped answering his phone. The only reason anyone knew he'd died was because Earl called the sheriff's office to report it. I bought a flashlight I didn't need and drove back to the cabin with Marge's words echoing in my head. My uncle and Earl, thick as thieves, talking about God knows what. That evening I made myself walk across the property line to Earl's house. His dogs didn't bark when I approached. They were on the porch again, all 3 of them pressed together in a pile of fur and nervous energy, their eyes tracking my movement without a sound. The largest one, a German shepherd mix with a graying muzzle, whined low in its throat as I climbed the porch steps. Earl answered the door before I could knock, like he'd been watching my approach through the window. Wondered when you'd come by. We need to talk. He studied me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he stepped aside and gestured me in. The inside of his house was neat and spare, nothing like the cluttered hermit's den I'd been expecting. A wood stove crackled in the corner, pushing back the evening chill. The walls were bare except for a single photograph over the mantel, a woman with kind eyes and Earl's arm around her waist, both of them smiling at the camera. "Sit," Earl said. "I'll get us something to drink." He disappeared into the kitchen and came back with 2 glasses of whiskey, the good stuff poured generous. He handed me one and settled into the chair across from mine, his movements slow and deliberate. "You saw the signs," he said. "It wasn't a question. The deer, the cameras, I hesitated, not sure how to describe what I'd seen in that photograph without sounding insane. "The eyes," Earl nodded slowly. "Took you 3 weeks, that's faster than your uncle." The whiskey burned going down, but I barely clear his throat noticed. "What is it? What the hell is out there?" Earl didn't answer right away. He stared into his glass like the amber liquid might hold some kind of answer, his weathered face cast in shadow by the fire's flickering light. "I don't know what it is," he said finally. "I've been watching it for 32 years and I still don't know, but I can tell you what it does and I can tell you it's real. 32 years. 1987, that's when I first saw it. First really saw it, I mean, not just the signs." He took a long drink. "I was different then. Younger, stronger, too damn curious for my own good. I thought I could figure it out. Document it maybe. Prove what I was seeing was real." "What happened?" "Nothing you'd want to happen to you." Earl set down his glass and looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "But if you want to understand what you're dealing with, you should see it for yourself. Tonight, if you've got the stomach for it." I should have said no. Every rational instinct screamed at me to walk out of that house, drive back to Wausau, and never set foot on that property again. But the image of those eyes was burned into my brain, and I knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I didn't see what had put them there. "Show me," I said. Earl led me to the back of his house, to a room I hadn't noticed from the front. It was darker here, the windows covered with heavy curtains that blocked what remained of the evening light. The only illumination came from a small lamp on a desk cluttered with notebooks and photographs. "Here," he said, pulling the curtain aside just far enough to reveal a narrow gap. "Watch the tree line, the big dead oak about 100 yards out. It likes to use that as a marker. How do you know it'll come? Because it always comes when there's someone new. It came for Vernon when he first moved in. It came for me when I bought this place. And now it'll come for you." He paused. "It wants you to see it." I pressed my eye to the gap in the curtain and waited. The forest beyond Earl's yard was all shadows and suggestion, the last gray light of dusk fading into true darkness. I could make out the dead oak he'd mentioned, a massive tree killed by lightning years ago, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. Beyond it, the woods stretched into blackness. For a long time, nothing happened. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, picking out details I'd missed at first. The shape of bushes, the pale trunks of birch trees, the uneven ground where the lawn gave way to forest. My pulse thudded in my ears, loud enough that I worried it might drown out any sound from outside. Then I saw them. Eyes, 2 amber points of light appearing in the darkness beyond the dead oak, exactly where Earl had said to look. They were reflecting something, the lamp behind me maybe, or some light source I couldn't identify. And they were fixed directly on the window where I stood. 8 feet off the ground, at least 8 feet. Maybe more. My breath stopped. The eyes didn't blink, didn't waver, didn't move at all. They just watched, with a patience that felt utterly inhuman. I could sense intelligence behind them, a cold awareness that was studying me. The same way I'd studied thousands of deer through rifle scopes over the years. "It sees you," Earl said quietly from somewhere behind me. "It knows you're watching." I couldn't respond. My mouth had gone dry, my tongue thick and useless. The eyes continued to stare, and now I could see that they were wrong in ways the photograph hadn't captured. They didn't reflect light the way animal eyes should. There was no tapetum lucidum glow, no simple biological mirror bouncing photons back at the source. These eyes seemed to generate their own light, a faint amber luminescence that pulsed almost imperceptibly. And they blinked, not vertically like a human or a dog. The lids, if they could be called that, slid closed from the sides like a reptile's nictitating membrane. When they opened again, the eyes had shifted, angled slightly to the left, as if the thing behind them had tilted its head. I jerked back from the window, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. "What is that?" The words came out cracked and breathless. "Earl, what the hell is that? I told you I don't know." He let the curtain fall closed and suddenly the room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. I've seen bears, wolves, mountain lions, everything that lives in these woods and some things that shouldn't. That out there doesn't match any of them. It's got to be something, some kind of animal, some you saw it blink. Earl's voice was flat. You saw the way it blinked. Does any animal, blink like that? I couldn't answer because he was right. Nothing blinked like that. Nothing I'd ever seen, nothing I'd ever read about, nothing that belonged in any forest on Earth. Get some sleep if you can, Earl said. It won't come any closer tonight, not while we're watching. How do you know? Because it's been 32 years, and it's never come inside. It watches, it waits. It lets you know it's there. He moved toward the door, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. But it doesn't come inside. Not yet. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Earl's living room with my rifle across my knees, watching the windows and listening to every creak and groan of the old house. Earl dozed in his chair across from me, apparently accustomed enough to this nightmare that he could still rest. His dogs stayed pressed against the front door, occasionally whimpering in their sleep. Sometime around 3:00 in the morning, I convinced myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing. The stress of the divorce, the isolation of the property, the creepy atmosphere of the woods. My mind had conjured those eyes out of nothing, shaped the darkness into something that matched my fears. It was the only explanation that made sense. Then dawn came, and with it a clarity that felt like a physical weight lifting from my chest. The forest outside Earl's windows looked normal. Birch trees, pine trees, undergrowth just starting to green with summer growth. No eyes, no presence. Nothing but woods I'd spent my whole life learning to read. I thanked Earl for the whiskey and the conversation, told him I'd be in touch, and drove back to my cabin with the windows down, letting the morning air clear my head. I had almost convinced myself it was over when night fell again. I was on the cabin porch watching the stars come out when I saw it moving through the trees. Not the eyes this time. The shape itself. It crossed a moonlit clearing maybe 60 yards from the cabin. Clear's throat, and in that pale light I saw it clearly enough to stop my heart. Bipedal, hunched shoulders that seemed too broad for its frame, arms that hung past where a human's knees would be, moving with a loping gait that ate up ground at an impossible speed. It was huge. The size of a grizzly standing upright, maybe bigger, and it moved through the trees like it owned them. I grabbed my rifle and shouldered it, trying to get the thing in my scope. But by the time I'd brought the glass to my eye, it was gone. Vanished into the deeper shadows at the edge of the clearing, leaving nothing behind, but a faint impression in the tall grass where it had passed. My hands were shaking so badly the rifle rattled against the porch railing. That wasn't a costume, that wasn't a bear. That wasn't anything I had a name for, anything that belonged in the natural world I'd spent my life learning to understand. It moved like something that had never been photographed or cataloged or pinned to a board in some university lab. It moved like something that had avoided detection for longer than humans had kept records. I went inside and locked every door, checked every window, pushed the heaviest furniture against the entrances. Then I sat in the darkness with my rifle and waited for morning, telling myself over and over that I hadn't seen what I'd seen. But I had. And somewhere out there in the trees watching my cabin with those amber eyes, it knew that I knew. The next day I drove back to Wausau and tried to pretend I was still a rational person living a rational life. I had clients booked for a weekend bow hunt. I had equipment to maintain, permits to file, all the mundane tasks that had structured my existence for almost a decade. But I couldn't stop seeing that silhouette crossing the clearing. Couldn't stop calculating its height based on the trees it had passed. The stride length that had carried it so quickly into shadow. 10 feet tall at least. Maybe more. Arms that suggested hands rather than paws. A gait that was neither human nor animal but something horribly in between. That night alone in my Wausau apartment, I lay awake until dawn staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself I'd seen a bear. An unusually large bear, a bear that had learned to walk upright for some reason. A bear that blinked sideways and watched windows with an intelligence that made my stomach turn. It wasn't a bear. I knew it wasn't a bear. And I knew I was going back to that cabin no matter how much the rational part of my brain screamed at me to sell the property and never look north again. I went back that weekend anyway. The bow hunters I'd scheduled, two brothers from Milwaukee, regulars for the past 3 years, called Friday morning to cancel. Family emergency, they said. Something about their mother's health. And I told them I understood. Even though part of me suspected they'd heard something in my voice during our last conversation. I'd been off, distracted, answering questions a beat too slow, losing CK of details I usually had memorized cold. Maybe they'd picked up on it. Maybe they just had bad timing. Either way, their cancellation left my weekend open, and instead of booking replacement clients or catching up on the maintenance I'd been neglecting, I found myself loading the truck with supplies I told myself were for cabin repairs. Extra batteries for the trail cameras I'd already lost 3 times. A thermal scope I'd special ordered 2 years ago for night hunts and never used. Enough food to stay a week if I needed to. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not my brother in Madison, Clear's throat. Not the few friends I still talked to after the divorce. Not even Marge at the hardware store when I stopped in Rhinelander for fresh batteries and a new padlock for the shed. She asked how the renovations were coming along and I said, "Fine, just fine. Everything's coming together." She looked at me the way people look at someone they've known for years who suddenly seems like a stranger, but she didn't push. Small towns are good for that. They notice everything and say nothing. I reached the cabin around 4:00 in the afternoon, earlier than I'd planned. The drive had felt shorter somehow, the miles passing in a blur while my mind replayed that silhouette crossing the clearing. 10 ft tall, arms past its knees. That loping gait covered ground like it was gliding rather than walking. Every time I blinked I saw it again. Every time I breathed I felt the weight of those amber eyes watching me from the tree line. The cabin looked exactly as I'd left it. Furniture still piled against the doors, windows still latched, the faint smell of coffee and gun oil hanging in the stale air. I'd been gone 3 days, but it felt like longer. Like time moved differently here, stretched thin by the presence of something that shouldn't exist. I spent the first hour undoing my own barricades, then the second setting up the thermal scope on a tripod near the kitchen window. The window faced north toward the ravine where the old-growth hemlocks grew thickest, and I'd noticed that the creature seemed to favor that approach. Maybe the cover was better there. Maybe it just liked the darkness under those ancient trees. Either way, if it came close tonight, I wanted to see it clearly, not to shoot it. I'd given up on that idea somewhere during the sleepless hours in Wausau. You didn't shoot something that moved like that, something that watched with intelligence behind its eyes. You studied it. You tried to understand it, and maybe, just maybe, you figured out how to make it leave you alone. Earl's truck pulled into my driveway around 6:00 just as the sun started its slow descent toward the western ridge. He climbed out holding a casserole dish covered in foil, and for a moment the scene was so normal, so perfectly ordinary that I almost laughed. Neighbors bringing food to the new arrival. Welcome to the neighborhood. Don't mind the 10 ft monster in the woods. Figured you'd be back, he said, handing me the dish. Beneath the foil I smelled something with beef and onions. Made enough for 2, but May, that's my oldest dog. She's not eating much these days. No sense letting it go to waste. I invited him in and we ate at the kitchen table while the light faded outside. Neither of us mentioned the creature. We talked about the weather, about the fishing on the chain of lakes to the south, about the new gas station going in on Highway 8 that would probably kill the old one closer to town. Normal conversation. Human conversation. The kind of talk that keeps the darkness at bay for a little while. But when the last of the daylight bled out of the sky, Earl's gaze drifted to the thermal scope on its tripod by the window. Planning to watch tonight. I need to see it again. The words came out before I could stop them. The full thing, not just eyes or a shape. I need to know what it actually looks like. Earl was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed back from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness gathering between the trees. His silhouette against the glass looked small somehow, fragile. A 70-year-old man who'd spent 32 years sharing his woods with something that defied explanation. "Your uncle said the same thing once," he said finally. "Spent a whole summer trying to get a good look. Set up blinds, stayed out all night with binoculars, even tried baiting it with deer carcasses he bought from the butcher in town." Clear's throat, he shook his head slowly. "Never worked. It only shows itself when it wants to. And when it wants to show you something, well, you'll see it whether you're ready or not." I didn't ask what that meant. I was afraid I already knew. Earl left around 8:00, his tail lights disappearing down the gravel drive and leaving me alone with the scope and in the Clear's throat, darkness and my own hammering pulse. I took up position by the window, one eye pressed to the thermal optic, sweeping the tree line in slow passes. Nothing. Just the cool blue of the trees, the occasional warm flicker of a small animal moving through the underbrush. Normal, natural. By 11:00, my eye was watering and my back ached from hunching over the scope. I was about to take a break, maybe make coffee, when I caught movement in the ravine. Heat signature. Large. Rising from the darkness between the hemlocks like something surfacing from deep water. My hands went slick on the scope's housing, but I forced myself to stay still, to keep watching. The shape resolved slowly, sections appearing piece by piece as it climbed the ridge toward the cabin. First the bulk of its torso, massive, radiating warmth in the cool night air. Then the arms, long and hanging loose, ending in shapes that made my stomach clench. Hands. Actual hands. 5 fingers spread wide, gripping a tree trunk as it pulled itself up the slope. The fingers were too long, jointed in too many places, and even through the thermal imaging I could see the claws at their tips, curved and dark, leaving gouges in the bark. I adjusted the scope's focus, trying to get more detail, and the creature obliged by stepping into a small clearing where the thermal signature was unobstructed by foliage. The snout came into view first. Wolf-like but stretched somehow, elongated in a way that suggested a jaw built for more than just biting. Lips pulled back, and I could see them pulling back even in thermal, the muscle structure clearly visible, revealing teeth that weren't quite canine and weren't quite human. Too many of them, overlapping at angles that shouldn't have fit in any natural mouth. Then the fur. I'd expected smooth, like a wolf or a German shepherd, something sleek and predatory. Instead, it was coarse, matted in places with something darker that registered as cooler in the thermal scope. Blood, maybe. Old blood gone sticky and cold. The fur covered most of its body except for patches on its chest where pale skin showed through. And across that skin I could see lines, scars, dozens of them crisscrossing like a road map of old violence. This thing had been hurt before many times, and it was still here. It stopped moving suddenly, its massive head swiveling toward the cabin, toward the window where I sat frozen with my eye pressed to the scope. Even through the flat thermal image I could sense its awareness. It knew I was watching. It had known the whole time. Then it did something that nearly made me drop the scope entirely. It raised one of those impossible hands, fingers splayed, claws catching the faint moonlight, and held it up toward me. Not a wave, not a threat, just an acknowledgement, a gesture that said, clearer than any words, "I see you too." I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged in the suddenly cold air. When I found the courage to look again, the clearing was empty. The creature had vanished back into the hemlocks, leaving nothing behind but the gouges in the tree trunk and the image of that hand seared into my memory. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't close my eyes without seeing those fingers, those scars, that gesture of recognition. Whatever lived in these woods wasn't just watching me like prey. It was acknowledging me like an equal, like something it wanted me to understand. I wasn't sure which possibility frightened me more. The signs started appearing 3 days later. I'd stayed at the cabin that whole time, sleeping in shifts during daylight hours, watching through the thermal scope every night. The creature didn't show itself again, not fully, but I caught glimpses at the edge of the scope's range. A heat signature moving parallel to the property line, a shape crossing the moonlit field where the beaver pond drained into the creek. Always at a distance, always just visible enough to let me know it was still there. On the 3rd morning, I walked out to check my cameras and found the first sign. My truck. Something had been at my truck. The driver's side mirror was angled differently than I'd left it. The glass pointed downward now, toward the ground. and when I checked the passenger side, I found the same adjustment. Both mirrors turned to face the dirt rather than the road. An annoyance if I'd been planning to drive, but I hadn't moved the truck since arriving. I'd been too focused on watching the tree line, too consumed by the scope and the darkness and my own mounting obsession. I straightened the mirrors and told myself it was nothing. Wind, maybe, or a large animal brushing against the truck in the night. But I knew better. The adjustments were too precise, too deliberate. Whatever had touched those mirrors had done so with purpose. That afternoon, I found my boot prints from the previous day's walk to the trail cameras. Next to them, pressed deep into the soft earth of the path, were other prints. Not paw prints, not bare prints. These were foot-shaped, roughly human in outline. But the proportions were all wrong. The foot was too long, the toes splayed too wide, and at the end of each toe I could see the deep punctures where claws had sunk into the ground. The stride length between prints was nearly 4 ft. Whatever made them had been walking upright, unhurried, following the exact path I'd taken the day before. Following me. I tracked the prints for nearly a quarter mile before they veered off toward the ravine, disappearing into the carpet of hemlock needles where the old-growth forest began. The whole way they paralleled my own tracks precisely, not just following the same general direction but stepping where I'd stepped, matching my route turn for turn. It had been walking in my footsteps, literally. When I got back to the cabin, I found my shed padlock hanging open. I'd locked it the day before, I was certain of that. The key was still in my pocket, the spare still hidden under the loose board on the east side of the porch. But the lock hung from the hasp like someone had opened it with a key of their own. And when I pulled the door open with shaking hands, I found my equipment rearranged. The fishing rods I'd left leaning against the back wall now stood by the door. My tackle box had been moved from its shelf to the floor. And in the center of the shed, positioned carefully on an overturned bucket like an offering on an altar, sat one of my missing trail camera memory cards. I stared at it for a long time, afraid to touch it, afraid of what it might contain. But eventually, the need to know overcame the fear, and I carried the card back to my laptop like it was made of glass. The images loaded slowly. Time stamps from 2 weeks ago, before I'd even noticed the cameras had been disturbed. Frame after frame of empty forest. The same stretch of trail I'd photographed 100 times before. Deer, squirrels, a raccoon nosing through the underbrush. Then near the end of the sequence, a series of images that made my vision tunnel. The creature standing directly in front of the camera, not caught by motion detection from a distance, positioned there deliberately, its massive form filling the frame. In the first image, it faced the camera head-on, those amber eyes reflecting the infrared flash, that impossible mouth hanging slightly open. In the second, it had turned to show its profile, the elongated snout and hunched shoulders clear against the dark forest behind it. In the third image, it held something up to the camera, my wallet. My wallet that I'd left in my truck in the center console, locked inside like always. My wallet with my driver's license visible through the clear plastic window. My name and address displayed for the camera for me. It knew who I was. It knew where I lived. Not just the cabin, but my real address, my apartment in Wausau, the place I went when I fled these woods. And it wanted me to know that it knew. I found my wallet back in the truck an hour later. The center console was unlocked. I never locked it, but I always closed it fully, and now it sat open an inch. The wallet was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing missing, nothing damaged, but it had been in those hands. Those impossible, too long, clawed hands had held my identification, examined my face in the plastic window, memorized the address printed in neat government type. Prey doesn't get a warning like that. Prey doesn't get a chance to understand what's hunting it. This was something else, something worse. This was a message. I called Earl that night from the cabin's landline. The cell signal was worthless this deep in the woods, and I didn't trust the cabin's satellite internet for anything important. He answered on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep. It went through my things, I told him. The words tumbled out in a rush. Everything from the mirrors to the footprints to the memory card. It took my wallet. It photographed itself holding my wallet. Earl, it knows my address, my real address in Wausau. Silence on the line. Then a long, slow exhale. "Your uncle's place in Wausau," Earl said finally. "The apartment off Sherman, it knows where that is." I hadn't told Earl where I lived. I was certain of that, but Vernon might have. 30 years of friendship, of sitting on that shared property line and talking about family and life and everything else. Of course, Vernon would have mentioned where his nephew lived. "Yes," I managed. "It knows." "Then you're not safe there either." Earl's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing weather patterns. "You understand that, right? It's not just watching your cabin anymore. It's watching you, learning you, everything about you." "Why?" The question came out barely louder than a whisper. "Why would it do that if it wanted to kill me? If it wanted to kill you, you'd be dead already." Earl's tone sharpened. "I told you before, this thing's been in these woods longer than the paper mill, longer than the town, longer than anyone, Ray. Members, it doesn't need to hunt. It doesn't need to eat. It's not doing this because it's hungry." "Then what does it want?" Another long silence. When Earl spoke again, his voice had dropped, gone soft and uncertain in a way that frightened me more than anything I'd seen through the thermal scope. "I don't know. 32 years and I still don't know. But whatever it is, you've got its attention now. Vernon had its attention for years before he died. And I've been wondering ever since whether that attention is what killed him in the end. Not teeth or claws or violence, just attention. The weight of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. The way it wears you down day by day until you can't carry it anymore." I heard the creak of bed springs as he shifted, heard the distant barking of his dog startled by something outside his window. "Don't come over here," he said abruptly. "Not tonight. Stay in your cabin. Keep the doors locked. And don't watch for it anymore. Looking for it just draws it closer. Trust me on that." I spent too many years looking before I learned to keep my eyes down. He hung up before I could respond. I sat in the darkness of my kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone fade into silence. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the pine branches against the roof in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing, deep and slow and patient. The thermal scope sat on its tripod by the window. I thought about looking through it, thought about sweeping the tree line one more time just to know if it was out there. But Earl's words echoed in my head. Looking for it just draws it closer. I left the scope where it was and retreated to the bedroom, pulling the curtains tight and wedging a chair under the door handle. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough. If that thing wanted in, no chair was going to stop it. But at least I wouldn't have to watch it coming. I lay awake for hours, listening to every creak and settle of the old cabin, every rustle of wind through the leaves outside. Around 3:00 in the morning, I heard something new. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the bedroom window, deliberate, patient, like someone knocking on a door and waiting politely for an answer. I didn't look. I pulled the pillow over my head and squeezed my eyes shut and forced myself to breathe. In and out, in and out, until the tapping finally stopped. When dawn came, I checked the window from outside. A single claw mark ran diagonally across the glass, not deep enough to break it, not sharp enough to leave more than a scratch, but deliberate, precise, like a tally mark on a prison wall, like it was keeping count. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Every creak of the cabin settling, every whisper of wind through the pines sent my heart slamming against my ribs. The tapping didn't return, but somehow the silence that replaced it was worse. Silence meant it was still out there watching, waiting with a patience that made my skin crawl. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I forced myself out of bed. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, weak, trembling, disconnected from any command my brain tried to send. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see the scratch on the glass. That single diagonal line catching the early light like a signature. I spent the day trying to convince myself I should leave, pack up the truck, drive back to Wausau, forget about the cabin and the inheritance and everything that came with it, sell the property to some unsuspecting buyer and pretend none of this had ever happened. But I couldn't. That was the terrible truth of it. The creature had my address. It knew where I lived in both places now, and running wouldn't change that. If anything, fleeing might provoke something worse, might signal that I was prey after all, something to be chased and cornered and finished. So I stayed. I reinforced what I could, wedging furniture against doors and checking every window latch twice. I loaded the .308 and kept it within arm's reach at all times. And when the sun began its descent and toward the tree line painting the sky in shades of amber that reminded me too much of those eyes, I positioned myself in the main room with a clear line of sight to both the front door and the largest window. Earl called around 6:00. "You still there?" His voice was gruff, but I heard the concern underneath. "Still here. Stubborn fool." But there was no real heat in it. "Listen, I've been thinking about what you said, about the wallet, the address. I don't think it's trying to threaten you, not exactly." "Then what?" A long pause. "It's introducing itself. That's what Vernon thought toward the end. He had this theory, said the thing was old, older than anything we could comprehend, and it had its own way of doing things, its own rituals, showing you it knows who you are, where you come from. That's like a handshake, a greeting. That's insane. So is a 10ft wolf thing that's been living in these woods since before there was a town here. Sanity stopped applying a long time ago." He coughed, a wet rattle that made me wince. "Point is, if it wanted you dead, you'd be dead. It's had 100 chances, it's choosing not to take them. What does it want then, if not to kill me? Hell if I know. 32 years and I still don't have an answer, but here's what I do know. The ones who run, the ones who try to pretend it doesn't exist, they're the ones who lose their minds. The ones who accept it, who learn to live with the watching, they survive. Most of them anyway." He hung up around 8:00. I was alone again, listening to the cabin settle around me as darkness crept in from the tree line. The temperature dropped with the sun, and I built a fire more for the comfort of the light than the warmth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and I found myself watching those shadows too closely, seeing shapes in them clear as throat that probably weren't there. By 11:00, I'd convinced myself the night would pass like any other. The creature had made its point with the wallet, with the window scratch. Maybe it was done with me for now. Maybe Earl was right and acceptance was the key to survival. I was wrong. The first sound came around midnight, a heavy footfall on the front porch. Distinct and deliberate, not the skittering of a raccoon or the light tread of a deer. This was weight, serious weight. Pressing down on the boards, I'd replace myself, making them groan in protest. I raised the rifle sighting on the door. My hands were steady now, the way they always got when the moment of truth arrived. Whatever fear I felt had condensed into something cold and hard in my chest, pushing everything else aside. Another footstep. Then another. Circling the porch, moving toward the window. I tracked the sound with the rifle barrel, pivoting slowly, keeping my breathing even. The fire crackled behind me, throwing my shadow huge and distorted across the far wall. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside the window. For a long moment nothing happened. The silence stretched out like a held breath. The cabin and the forest and everything in between, waiting to see what came next. I could feel my pulse in my temples, in my throat, in the tips of my fingers where they rested against the trigger guard. The face appeared in the window, so suddenly that I nearly fired on instinct. Only years of training kept my finger from squeezing, kept me from putting a bullet through the glass and whatever was behind it. I wish I had fired. I wish I had that image to blame on a split-second glimpse, on fear and adrenaline and the distortion of the glass between us. But I didn't fire. I looked. And what I saw burned itself into my memory with a clarity that no amount of time will ever fade. The snout came first, pressing close enough to the glass that I could see individual whiskers, each one thick as fishing line and twitching with some alien awareness. The nose was canine in structure but massive, wet and black, the nostrils flaring as it drew in my scent through the window frame's gaps. Breath fogged the glass in rhythmic pulses. Then the eyes. Those amber eyes I'd seen in photographs and through thermal scopes, but never like this. Never 3ft away with nothing but a pane of glass between us. They caught the firelight and threw it back as something molten, something alive with an intelligence I couldn't begin to comprehend. Not animal intelligence, I'd seen that plenty. Had spent my career reading the minds of prey and predator alike through their eyes. This was something else entirely, something that understood me in ways I would never understand it. The face pulled back slightly, allowing me to see the whole of it for the first time. The skull was elongated, wolf-like in its basic structure, but stretched and wrong. The proportions belonging to something that had never existed in any biology textbook. lips peeled back from teeth. Too many teeth, rows of them overlapping like a shark's, yellower with age and sharp enough to shear through bone. Scars traced pale lines through the coarse fur around its muzzle, old wounds that had healed without any softening. It tilted its head as it studied me, a gesture so recognizably canine that my mind tried to latch onto the familiarity, tried to convince me this was just a wolf, just a big wolf, nothing to lose my sanity over. Then it raised one hand and pressed it flat against the glass. The hand was the worst part, worse than the teeth or the eyes or the impossible size of the thing, because the hand was almost human. 5 fingers jointed in the right places, but also jointed in wrong places, bending at angles that made my stomach lurch. The palm was wide as a dinner plate covered in rough pads like a dog's foot, but the fingers had nails, not claws, not quite, curved, dark talons that could have been fingernails grown monstrous, grown for tearing and gripping and holding. The fingers spread against the glass, leaving smears I knew would still be there in the morning. The creature's head tilted further, those burning eyes never leaving mine, and somewhere in the depths of its throat, a sound began to build. Not a growl, not a howl, something between, something that vibrated through the glass and into my bones. It was trying to communicate. I understood that with a certainty that defied logic. This thing, this impossible thing that shouldn't exist, was trying to tell me something, and I had no idea how to listen. Then it smiled. Wolves don't smile, I know that. I've spent my life around predators, and I know that when an animal shows its teeth, it's not a greeting. It's a warning or a challenge or simple mechanical function. But this creature smiled. The corners of its muzzle drew back, those overlapping teeth gleaming in the firelight, and there was something almost pleased in the expression. Something satisfied. It had wanted me to see it, had been building to this moment through weeks of signs and messages and careful revelation. And now that I'd finally looked, finally understood what I was sharing these woods with, it was happy. That was when I fired. The bullet punched through the glass and into the night. I didn't aim, just pulled the trigger, desperate to do something, anything, to break whatever spell had frozen me in place. The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space, and the window exploded outward in a shower of fragments that glittered like ice in the firelight. The creature was gone. 1 second it was there, that terrible smile stretching wider, and the next there was nothing but empty darkness and cold air rushing in through the shattered window. I chambered another round, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The truck was outside, and outside was where the thing had retreated. For all I knew, it was circling even now, looking for another way in. The front door rattled. I spun, rifle up, sighting on the weathered wood. The rattling came again, not a knock, not a push. The doorknob was turning, slowly, deliberately, the handle rotating in a way that suggested fingers on the other side understanding how locks worked, testing. I'd wedged a chair under the handle. The door couldn't open more than a crack, and through that crack I saw something that made every horror I'd witnessed so far seem like a prelude. An eye. A single amber eye pressed to the gap, the pupil dilating as it adjusted to the interior light, looking at me, looking through me. The door rattled again, harder this time. The chair scraped against the floor, moving an inch, then another. I fired again, aimed at that eye and pulled the trigger, and the bullet punched through the wood in a spray of splinters. Sound split the night. Half howl, half scream, carrying pain and fury in equal measure. The door stopped rattling, but the sound didn't stop. It changed, evolved, became something like laughter. Not human laughter, not animal, something in between. Rolling through the darkness outside with a mocking edge that made my blood run cold. I backed away from the door, rifle raised, waiting for the next assault. Instead, I heard footsteps on the roof. Heavy, deliberate, moving from the front of the cabin toward the back. Then scratching, long, slow drags of claws against shingles, peeling them back one by one. It was looking for another way in, and I only had so many bullets. The next 3 hours were the longest of my life. It circled the cabin endlessly, testing every possible entry point. The broken window, which I'd barricaded with a table and blankets. The back door, which I'd reinforced with everything heavy I could drag across the floor. The walls themselves, claws dragging against logs in patterns that almost sounded like writing. Twice more I fired. Once when a face appeared at the kitchen window. Once when claws started to pry at the damaged front door. Each time it retreated, but it didn't leave. I could hear it out there, moving through the underbrush, circling like a shark around wounded prey, waiting. Around 3:00 in the morning, headlights appeared through the trees. I didn't understand at first. My mind had narrowed down to the simple calculus of survival. Watch, wait, shoot. The concept of rescue hadn't factored in, but the lights kept coming, bouncing down the gravel road, and the blast of a truck horn shattered the night. Earl. His truck skidded to a stop in front of the cabin, headlights blazing, horns still blaring in an endless wail. I heard his voice over the noise. "Get out here, damn you." And then a shotgun blast that rolled across the property like thunder. The creature screamed again. That same hybrid sound, pain and rage, and something I could only call indignation. Through the front window I saw a shape retreat from the tree line, massive and hunched, moving with that impossible loping gait toward the deeper darkening. SS of the forest. "Now," Earl's voice cracked with age but carrying absolute authority. "Get in the truck now." I didn't argue, grabbed the rifle, hit the door at a run, and threw myself into the passenger seat of Earl's truck. He had it in reverse before I'd even closed the door, tires spitting gravel as we backed down the road at a speed that should have put us in a ditch. "It's not gone," he said, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "Just pulled back. Dawn's coming. It doesn't like the light." "How did you know?" "Heard the shots." He jerked the wheel, swinging us around to face forward and punch the accelerator. 3 rounds, maybe 4, then nothing. Either you were dead or you were too scared to shoot anymore. Either way, figured I should check. The creature appeared at the edge of the road as we passed. I saw it in the headlights for maybe 2 seconds. The full height of it, the shoulders, the arms that hung past its knees, that terrible face turning to track our passage with those burning eyes. Then we were past and it didn't follow, but it watched. I could feel those eyes on us all the way to Earl's property line. We sat in Earl's kitchen until the sun came up. He poured whiskey for both of us and I drank mine in one swallow, then held out the glass for more. My hands were shaking so badly that the glass rattled against the bottle when he refilled it. "You hit it," Earl said, not a question, twice. Maybe 3 times, twice. Once through the window, once through the door. "Did it bleed?" I tried to remember. The chaos of the moment, the muzzle flash, the spray of wood and glass. "I don't know, it screamed, both times, but you didn't see blood." "No." Earl nodded slowly like this confirmed something he'd suspected. "Vernon shot it too, once in the summer before he died. Said it stood there and let the bullet hit, then pulled it out of its own chest and dropped it on the ground like it was handing back a gift it didn't want." I stared at him. "That's not possible." "Of this is possible, that's the point." He took a long drink from his own glass. "It could have killed you tonight, could have killed Vernon any night it wanted, could have killed me 30 years ago when I first saw those eyes in my tree line, but it doesn't. It watches, it learns, it lets us know it's there, and then it waits." "For what?" I've spent 3 decades asking that question. Only answer I've got is that maybe it doesn't want anything we'd understand. Maybe it's just there, part of the woods. Part of something older than anything else in this world, and we're just entertainment or curiosity or something else we don't have a word for. Dawn broke full while we sat there, light spilling across Earl's cluttered kitchen and making everything feel almost normal, almost safe. His dogs had come out of hiding by then, the oldest one, May, resting her graying muzzle on my knee like she understood what I'd been through. What do I do now? The question sounded pathetic, but I needed to ask it. Needed someone to tell me there was a path forward. Earl was quiet for a long time, then he stood close to the window and looked out at the morning forest. "You could leave," he said finally. "Sell the property, move somewhere far away, try to forget any of this happened. That's what most people would do." He paused. "That's what most people should do, but you've seen it now, really seen it, and it's seen you right back." He turned to face me. "Vernon tried to leave after his summer of watching. Made it about 6 months in Madison before he came back. Said he couldn't sleep in a city. Said every time he closed his eyes, he saw those amber eyes staring at him from the darkness. Said the only place he could rest was here, where at least he knew what was watching. And you?" "I stopped leaving decades ago." Earl's smile was thin and tired. "Told myself it was because of the dogs, the property, the life I'd built here. But that was a lie. Truth is, I'm afraid of what would happen if I left for good. Afraid of what it would do if I broke the arrangement. What arrangement? The one we have. It watches, I watch back. Neither of us crosses the line. He returned to his chair, settling into it with the weariness of a man who'd carried this weight for longer than I'd been alive. Your uncle had the same deal. 30 years of watching each other, him and the creature. When he died, the deal ended. Now it's looking for a new one. I stared at him for a long time. The whiskey was starting to hit, blurring the edges of my terror into something almost manageable. You're saying it wants me to stay, to take Vernon's place. I'm saying it's been waiting for someone to take his place. Whether that's you or the next person who inherits that cabin, I don't know. But someone was always going to come and someone was always going to see it. That's how it works. I left Earl's place around noon, after he insisted I eat something and sleep for at least a few hours on his co. The drive back to Wausau should have felt like an escape, like freedom from the nightmare I'd been living. Instead, it felt like running, and I'd spent my whole life teaching people that running from predators only made them chase harder. I didn't file a report. I'd thought about it, driving to the DNR office in Rhinelander, showing them the photos on my phone, the claw marks on the door, the bullet holes in the cabin. But Earl's warning echoed in my head. He'd tried in 1987, lost his job, lost his credibility, lost everything except the property and the watching. And what good had any of that done? Besides, what would I say? That a 10FT Wolfman had spent 3 hours trying to break into my cabin. That I'd shot it twice and it had laughed at me. They'd think I was crazy or drunk or both. So I said nothing. Told my brother in Madison that I'd been doing some late-night work and a bear had gotten too curious. Told my remaining hunting clients that the cabin was still under renovation and we'd be running fall season out of Wausau instead. Told myself that if I just waited long enough, everything would start to make sense again. It didn't. I sold the guide business 4 months later. Marcus Weiland, one of my competitors, had been sniffing around for years, and I gave him a price he couldn't refuse. My clients were confused. Some of them had been coming to me for nearly a decade, but I made up a story about health problems, and they accepted it with the awkward sympathy people always offer when they don't know what else to say. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. I couldn't stand being in the woods anymore. Every rustling branch made me flinch. Every animal call made my hand reach for a rifle that wasn't there. I'd spent my entire adult life building a career around my love of the forest, and now the forest felt like enemy territory. I moved from my apartment to a place closer to downtown Madison. 4th floor, no trees visible from any window. I took a job at a sporting goods distributor, corporate stuff, inventory and logistics, the kind of work that let me stay inside fluorescent-lit offices from 9 to 5. My new coworkers thought I was quiet, reserved, a little jumpy. They didn't know about the nightmares, the way I'd wake up at 3:00 in the morning drenched in sweat, the echo of claws on wood still rattling in my ears, the way I couldn't look out windows after dark without seeing shapes at the edge of the streetlights, the way every amber-eyed dog in the city made my pulse spike. My brother figured something had broken during the divorce, and I'd finally cracked. He staged an intervention of sorts, drove up from Madison one weekend with sandwiches and beer, tried to get me to talk about Sarah, about what had really happened up at the cabin. I told him what I'd told everyone else. Bear trouble. Needed to get away for a while. Life changes. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, that mixture of concern and frustration that families get when they know you're hiding something but can't force you to share. Eventually, he stopped asking. They all did. I dated occasionally, nothing serious. I couldn't bring myself to stay anywhere overnight that wasn't my own apartment, and that made things complicated. One woman, a coworker named Julie, invited me to her family's lake house for a weekend. I made it as far as the parking lot before the sight of the tree line triggered a panic attack that left me gasping against my steering wheel for 20 minutes. We stopped seeing each other after that. Earl called monthly, just like he promised. The creature was still there, still watching. He'd see eyes in his tree line sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep. The scratch marks on his property line had gotten deeper, more frequent. But it hadn't approached his cabin, hadn't tried to come inside. "It's waiting for you," he said one night, his voice crackling through the phone line. "Every time I see it, it looks toward your property. Like it knows you'll be back eventually. I'm not coming back." That's what Vernon said too, for a while. I still own the cabin. I've tried to sell it 3 times, even called a realtor in Rhinelander to get the process started. Each time something stops me. A sick feeling in my gut, a tightness in my chest that makes it hard to breathe. Earl thinks it's the creature's doing. Some kind of influence it exerts on anyone who's seen it, binding them to those woods in ways they can't explain. I think he might be right. The other day I found myself looking at the drive time from Madison to Rhinelander. Just curious, I told myself, just wondering how long it would take. An hour and a half, maybe 2, depending on traffic. Not that I'm going back. I've made that clear to everyone, especially myself. The cabin can rot for all I care. The creature can watch empty windows and an overgrown yard until the forest reclaims the whole property. I'm done with those woods. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wake up with the taste of pine and cold air on my tongue. I lie there in my Madison apartment listening to the city sounds that should make me feel safe, and I feel something pulling at me. A thread I didn't know was attached, running from my chest out through the darkness, all the way back to that tree line, where amber eyes wait with infinite patience. Earl says Vernon felt it, too, toward the end. The pull, the need to return. He fought it for years, and then one morning he woke up in his truck, parked in front of the cabin with no memory of making the drive. A month later he was dead. Heart attack, the coroner said. Natural causes. Earl doesn't believe in natural causes anymore. Neither do I. I'm telling this story because someone needs to know. Because if I disappear one day, if I'm found dead in that cabin with claw marks on the walls and terror frozen on my face, I want there to be a record, a warning, something to tell the next person who inherits the property that they should burn it to the ground and salt the earth and never, ever look into those woods after dark. But I know they won't listen. Just like I didn't listen to Earl's warnings. Just like Vernon didn't listen to whoever warned him decades ago. The thing in those woods has been there longer than memory, and it will be there long after I'm gone. It watches, it waits. It chooses its audience with care. And once it's chosen you, you're part of the story forever. I sleep with the lights on now, every light in the apartment all night long. My electricity bill is embarrassing, but it's better than the alternative. Better than lying in darkness, knowing that somewhere out there, those amber eyes are open and watching. Always watching. Last week I found a scratch on my bedroom window. A single diagonal line, just like the one on the cabin glass. I live on the 4th floor. There are no trees nearby. No way for anything to reach that window from the outside. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone. I just stood there, tracing the mark with my finger, feeling the groove in the glass, where something sharp had pressed against it with deliberate precision. A tally mark. Like the one before. Like it's keeping count. And somewhere in the darkness of my mind, the part that still remembers what it felt like to be brave, I heard that sound again. That low, rumbling laugh rolling through the night, with a patience that spans centuries. It knows where I am. It's always known. And one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe years from now, It's going to collect on whatever debt I owe for having seen its face. Until then, I wait. Just like Earl waits. Just like Vernon waited all those years ago. We're all part of the same story now, bound together by amber eyes and the smell of cold pine, and a creature that watches from the darkness between the trees. I used to love the forest. I used to feel more at home under a canopy of leaves than I ever did in any building made by human hands. That man feels like a stranger to me now. A ghost from a life I can barely remember. These days, I just try to get through each night without screaming. Some nights I succeed. Some nights I wake up with the phone in my hand, Earl's number already dialed, just to hear a human voice tell me that I'm not crazy. That it's real. That I'm not alone in this nightmare. I'm 35 years old. I have maybe 40 years left if I'm lucky. 40 years of looking over my shoulder. 40 years of lights burning through the darkness. 40 years of knowing that out there, somewhere in the Wisconsin Northwoods, something is waiting for me to come home. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake more than the fear or the memories or the scratch on my window. Some nights I want to go. Some nights the pull is so strong that I can barely breathe. And the only thing stopping me from getting in my car and driving north is the knowledge that if I start, I might never stop. Vernon went back. After everything he saw, after all those years of watching, he went back. And so did Earl, and so will I eventually. The creature is patient. It has been patient for longer than human beings have existed in those woods. It will be patient for whatever time it takes. And when I finally return, when the pull becomes too strong to resist, and I find myself standing on that familiar porch, looking out at the tree line as darkness falls, those amber eyes will be waiting. They're always waiting.